So Warhammer 40K 10th edition has had its initial pass of error corrections. While Games Workshop might have fixed a fair few issues, let's talk about a few of the things that they might have missed. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd take a look at Games Workshop's Errata and updates for 10th edition 40k, and particularly highlight a few things that I thought were interesting that they didn't really get addressed in the past Errata update. So far in 40k 10th edition, Games Workshop's released some index cards with a fair few errors in them, both on the printed version and on the digital downloads. Though after a fair bit of no doubt fairly vocal feedback from the community, most of those issues are arguably now fixed. First up, they patched the differences between the digital and the physical copies, which there were a fair few of. Then they followed up with a big errata document for the index cards, changing a bunch of entries on the digital files directly and having the errata to show up any of the differences between the original publication. And quite a few of the major problems that they created for themselves are now fixed. I think it was pretty handy to have a ruling on things like the knights re-rolling ones and when that applied, or stuff like the Death Core of Krieg's Medipack. I'd argue that overall they did a pretty good job of hitting most of the major issues that people had questions about, though in this video I thought it might be interesting to follow up and just talk about a few of the things that could probably use a bit more of a ruling. I thought that perhaps one of the most interesting things about this index errata was that all of it was errata. They didn't do any FAQs this time. Maybe they're trying to do a bit of a shift of mentality with that and trying to fix just about everything that is unclear in actual errata and changes to the rules, as opposed to issuing FAQs to clarify the rules. I guess that might well be the most sensible way overall, as it means that if people come to the indexes new, the rule that's written in their digital update should be the right one, and it means they don't have to read that rule and then read the FAQ interpretation of that rule to understand it. If they can fix just about everything with errata, then that probably is the better way, particularly at the moment while all the index rules are free and online. Previously though, when they've generally issued errata updates, it's usually been errata for changes to the rules, plus a whole bunch of FAQs just saying yes or no to certain questions that quite commonly crop up. I feel like while they did do quite a good job of fixing most of the things via errata, a few things really could use some FAQ style answers, just for a few individual things within some indexes, plus some rules that are kind of generalised across multiple different armies. I guess in 10th edition they might be seeing their designer's commentary document as their version of the FAQ this time. That one tries to give generic faction neutral examples for certain questions that people might have, and adds a bit more clarity to some definitions. Today, though, I thought we could just focus on a few things that probably could use another update of some sort or another. A few rules debates that have been being had in 10th edition 40k that haven't really been fixed by the FAQ, and hopefully Games Workshop might choose to shed some light on one way or the other at some point in the future. First up, there seems to be a bit of a weird rules conflict between the Fire Overwatch stratagem and certain units that can fire Overwatch additional times in one turn. There are quite a lot of really quite powerful units in 40k that have the ability to use extra stratagems for free in one turn, often 0 CP uses of another stratagem, and a lot of them also have the rider that you can use the stratagem even if it has been used on a different unit this phase. That gets around the core rules bit that means that you can only use each stratagem once per phase, even if it's on different units. The question that a fair few people have is whether or not this applies to the Overwatch stratagem, 1 CP to basically fire some reactive shots in the enemy turn, usually hitting on 6s but can be very potent with anything that auto hits like flamers. Some characters specifically have an ability that works like this specifically for Overwatch, so 0 CP Overwatch for things like the Hexmark Destroyer. Usually phrased in the same way, you can use it even if it's already been used on a different unit this phase. Those ones definitely imply that its rules as intended, that they'd be able to fire Overwatch even if something else already has in the same phase, but it runs up against some wording in the actual Overwatch stratagem itself, saying that you can't use it any more than once per turn. I think it does that to prevent you, say, both firing Overwatch both in the enemy movement phase and in the enemy charge phase as well. Perhaps stopping a unit that could Overwatch from being able to fire twice in the same turn with some devastating firepower. I'm kind of surprised that they didn't FAQ this one way or the other. At the moment it's kind of intended that you should be able to use the extra Overwatch, otherwise why would things like Hexmark Destroyers have this rule? It still makes Overwatch free for them, so it's not useless, but it would be a bit strange for them to write a clause for the rule to say that you can do it at the same time as something else fires Overwatch, even though the wording on the core stratagem prevents it from working for a different reason. I'd guess that when they get round to it, they'd probably say that things like the Hexmark could also fire their own version of Overwatch, but until then, rules as written, it seems like they probably can't. Another debate that I've seen online a fair bit is the ignores modifiers rule versus damage reduction. A few units in the game, like say Trajan Valoris or Mortarion, they've got rules that grant ignores modifier type abilities to the unit that they're leading or units nearby. Trajan's rule says that models in the units can ignore modifiers to their characteristics in the unit or any rolls or tests made for them. And Mortarion simply grants ignores modifiers to the unit that's within range with similar kind of wording. For the most part, it's fairly obvious. Things like stealth won't debuff the hit rolls, or say enemy death guard wouldn't reduce the toughness characteristic of the models, those modifiers get ignored, so it can be pretty helpful for keeping your units functioning to normal capacity. What seemed to have caused a fair bit of debate, though, is whether abilities like -1 damage modify the characteristic of the weapons when they make attacks. So, say for example, would a unit that was led by Trajan Valoris get the -1 damage to their attacks characteristics if they say attacked a Redemptor Dreadnought? I've seen this argued by a fair few people on both sides, and it doesn't look like there's a unanimous opinion on the tournament circuit as well, with different tournaments ruling it in different ways. I believe that Games Workshop's own Tacoma Open tournament said that it doesn't affect damage, but this isn't really an official ruling from them, it's just their own tournament organisers. It's definitely possible that Games Workshop themselves might rule differently. You can debate things like, say, whether the weapon's damage characteristic is part of the own model's characteristic, or whether it becomes an attack once you make that attack. The past precedent from 9th edition implies that it might affect damage modifiers when they ruled things like that kind of unexpectedly. And while there's an entire section in the rules commentary regarding modifiers, it doesn't really seem to specifically cover this sort of situation, though it might imply one thing or another. I feel like just for the sheer amount of debate that this seems to have generated, it's probably at least worthy of an FAQ or an Errata update. At least it's a fair bit more of an edge case scenario though, only covering a few uncommon rules and how they interact. One other rule that I was expecting them to clarify as well in their Errata update was the Tau Empire's For the Greater Good special rule. Another one that's definitely caused a whole bunch of debate, and they probably should have said one way or the other. In my opinion, at least, I think it's kind of obvious what they're trying to intend with this one. The flavor text says that the Tau units work in pairs. The outcome is that you have an observer unit and a guided unit with +1 to hit. But rules as written, it doesn't really appear that there's much that prevents the units that are being guided with the +1 to hit from then going on to be observer units for another unit that they can guide. So kind of daisy chain the Tau Empire +1 to hit rules, so you could have an entire firebase each guiding one unit and then observing for the next, and giving them all +1 to hit all the way along. Again, I've definitely seen it debated by some people, but my reading at the moment at least would be that this does seem to check out at least rules as written as best I can tell, even if the works in pairs ruling kind of implies that it should be just sets of 2 as opposed to a big daisy chain of Tau spotting for each other. Tau and 40k at the moment certainly need all the help they can get really, they are struggling quite a lot right now. It means it's not really the most overpowered thing in the world, even if they can access a lot more +1s to hits than Games Workshop might have intended. Then my guess would be that if they do decide to address it, they'll probably just make it clear that they can only work in pairs, and probably change the points costs on a bunch of Tau units that are a bit underpowered right now. Next up, there's a rules debate for the Necrons over really quite an important stratagem, the Protocol of the Undying Legion. This one being about how many Necron warriors get reanimated when you trigger it. It's basically a reactive reanimation stratagem. When your opponent shoots or fights you, you get to have a fair few warriors stand back up. The perhaps slightly confusing bit is the double statement that they have in the effect. They say that your unit reactivates reanimation protocols and reanimates D3 wounds, and then get a small bonus to that if there's a Necron character in the unit. Usually that's going to be nice and straightforward. Most of the time when you reanimate models, you roll D3 wounds and that's how many get restored. But in particular, it's not the case for Necron warriors, perhaps one of the units that you're most likely to want to use this reanimation for. And Necron warriors don't just reanimate D3 slain models, they either get D6 if they're not on an objective, or D3+3 if they are. I think it's genuinely ambiguous whether or not you actually just trigger reanimation protocols as normal and just take the D3 wounds as them just redescribing the effect of the reanimation protocols, or whether even Necron warriors just reanimate D3 wounds or D3+1, and that number replaces the normal amount that's reanimated for the Necron warriors. I think strictly rules as written, I'd probably read that as the latter personally, though again I have seen this one debated between people. And again, this one will probably be quite a simple fix from GW, perhaps one that's better fixed by Errata than FAQ this time. They just need to decide whether it's just D3 in all cases, or just activate reanimation protocols as per normal, and get a +1 if there's a character in the unit. Finally, just for a few more quickfire ones that I think is kind of obvious what the intent is myself, but again I have seen people debating the finer points of the wording of the rules. It's one to command point regeneration. In the bit about how many command points you can gain in each battle round, it says that you can basically only gain a maximum of 1 per battle round outside of the command point that players gain at the start of the command phase. My reading of that will be the single 1 command point that you get just as per normal at the start of the command phase, though a few other characters also allow you to gain a command point at this time, say for example the Swarm Lord and Lord Solar Leontus. I think you could genuinely argue that as that command point happens at the start of the command phase, it's also exempt from the normal restrictions, so you could in theory have that one plus an additional one that you generate each battle round. I really don't think that that's the intent of the rule, to be honest. I think that this sentence is just referring to the single command points that all armies gain just per standard, though I can see the argument and probably something that Games Workshop should patch. Otherwise, I feel like they may be a little bit unclear on things like Tyranid's Alien Cunning that allows you to redeploy things after deployment. And again, I feel like there's probably two different ways that you could read this. The way that I'd probably go for is literally after the deployment step, which is just before the determine first turn step. So you get to redeploy 3 of your Tyranid units, but you don't have the perfect information as to whether you're going first or not, so you can't just put a whole load of things forward to go on the offensive, or pull a whole load of things back to try and keep them safe. However, though, in the sequence for initiating a battle in Warhammer 40K, there is a section after the first turn roll that says use pre-battle rules, which I guess you could argue that this, as something that happens after deployment, falls into. Again, that's really quite a common rule that's worded in a similar sort of way on a whole bunch of different datasheets. Again, seems another area that Games Workshop really could get round to FAQing, I think. Finally, and just to come to a couple of issues of weirdness that I have talked about on the channel in the past, I do feel like it would probably be helpful to make some sort of ruling with towering and ruins with windows. I don't really think that the towering rule itself is particularly a problem. There's plenty of things in the game that have the towering keyword that aren't overpowered, but my main issue is the way that it works at the moment. It means that towering models are just massively more powerful on any table that's got a whole load of windows in the ruins. If you're playing on a table like that, then the towering model might be able to see literally everything on the board. Whereas if you're playing on a table that's got a whole load of ruins without windows, you'd probably be able to hide an awful lot of infantry and smaller vehicles and things from the knight's firepower. I just think that the rule as it stands at the moment is a little bit unhelpful. It seems that the common tournament ruling for this is to just count windows in their ruins as filled in for all the game, just to make sure all terrain sets are playable against knights or any other towering things with a whole bunch of guns. If you just let them shoot exactly what they want, then the game just gets very alpha striky. They can still get a lot more line of sight than normal by seeing over the ruins, but I still think that it isn't really very helpful given the terrain sets that people play on, and previous obscuring rules basically being introduced to stop things just being a shooting gallery for ruins with windows. When the vast majority of tournaments are house ruling something, it kind of implies that Games Workshop should probably get round to fixing it themselves. In any case, there's just a few of the more major examples that I've seen debated the most in Warhammer 40k at the moment. Hopefully things that Games Workshop might get round to catching when they do issue another FAQ to the game. I'd guess that probably won't come before the Autumn Balance Pass, or potentially even the next Balance Data Slate, which I guess will probably be January. Let me know what you think of these individual cases and which way you play them at the moment, and by all means let me know any other things that you think that Games Workshop could do with issuing an FAQ for. I'm sure there's a whole load more things that I haven't covered here. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support there. The channel's Patreons are what allow me to keep on making all these videos quite so regularly, and I do try and give out a few benefits, such as being able to vote on what sort of things come next on the channel, seeing occasional videos early, and automatic entry into the monthly prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.